Growing up during the late 1990s in Nigeria, our primary and secondary schools were filled with Ghanaian teachers. And as a young boy, I always wondered why. These Ghanaian teachers were typically more astute scientifically and mathematically than their Nigerian counterparts. They mostly taught mathematics, physics, and other science related subjects. They also taught French as an elective course. I sometimes wondered why these intelligent people couldn't thrive back home in their country. At least I was aware at the time that it wasn't as if Nigeria was the best of places to be. But obviously, for them to be here, it meant that Nigeria was better, at least economically, than Ghana. I would later find out that the economic decline in Ghana could be traced back to a man named Kwame Nkrumah, a man that, to my astonishment, was idolized during his time and still is idolized. So, what exactly is the backstory here? What really happened back home in Ghana that triggered a mass migration? Well, sit back and let's find out.
Kwame Nkrumah had a cult-like following, and he pretty much still does. He is seen as Messiah to many Africans, and I don't doubt that he had good intentions, but the path to hell, they say, is paved with good intentions. I believe Africa is at that point where we must investigate our past thoroughly, so we can better understand how to chart our future. My goal in this video is to bring out the facts and objectively investigate the man Kwame Nkrumah, the machinations of his administration, and the socialist movement he pioneered across Africa as he made Ghana his pilot test. And after these facts are presented, you can go ahead to make your own conclusions, or you could do more research, which would be even better. I should say that if you love Nkrumah unabashedly and you see him as a redeemer, Osagyefo as he is famously called, this video is likely going to offend you, so I strongly suggest that you skip it. There's a lot on Kwame Nkrumah on the internet, particularly here on YouTube, and I don't want to bother myself with that. I am more concerned about highlighting post-independence Africa and the self-sabotage by her leaders, one of which is Kwame Nkrumah. Regardless of whatever involvement the CIA might have had in his downfall, Nkrumah made certain decisions that had a huge negative impact on the Ghanaian populace, both politically and economically. And my aim here is to show that we Africans need to take accountability for our actions, something that Nkrumah never really did. This continent is ours, and it will never develop until we become critically thinking people who are willing to take self-audit of our actions and our ways and be more responsible moving forward. So help us God. Let's run through Nkrumah's early years. After Nkrumah's elementary education, he started getting involved in politics and founded the Nzima Literary Society. He had heard journalist and future Nigerian president Nnamdi Azikiwe speak. The two men met, and Azikiwe's influence increased Nkrumah's interest in black nationalism. Nkrumah then furthered his education in an HBCU in Philadelphia on the advice of Nnamdi Azikiwe. Between 1935 and 1939, he obtained master's degrees from Lincoln University and from the University of Pennsylvania. He studied the literature of socialism, notably Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, and of nationalism. These two names are worthy of note. Eventually, Nkrumah came to describe himself as a non-denominational Christian and a Marxist socialist. Nkrumah was an activist student, organizing a group of expatriate African students in Pennsylvania and building it into the African Students Association of America and Canada, becoming its president. Some members felt that the group should aspire for each colony to gain independence on its own. Nkrumah urged the Pan-African strategy. He spent his time on political organizing. He was one of the principal organizers of the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester. The Congress elaborated a strategy for supplanting colonialism with African socialism. I repeat, African socialism. They agreed to pursue the Federal United States of Africa with interlocking regional organizations governing through separate states of limited sovereignty. They planned to pursue a new African culture without tribalism, democratic within a socialist system, synthesizing traditional aspects with modern thinking, and for this to be achieved by non-violent means if possible. The question one asked was non-violence towards who exactly? Just the Europeans or Africans as well? But I digress. Among those who attended the conference was the Venerable W.E.B. Du Bois, along with some who later took prominent roles in leading their nations to independence, including Hastings Banda of Nyasaland, now known as Malawi, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, and Obafemi Awolowo of Nigeria. Nkrumah believed that he had what it took to reshape the African continent according to his ideological beliefs, and he wasn't interested in entertaining disagreement or dissent. This right here, if you know anything about history, is exactly how tyrants are born. Leadership and compulsion can never coexist. Anyways, back home in the Gold Coast, J.B. Dankwa had formed the United Gold Coast Convention (UGCC) to work for self-government by constitutional means. He invited Nkrumah to serve as the UGCC's General Secretary. Nkrumah returned home in late 1947 and assumed the position of General Secretary. His addresses drew large crowds, leading to a massive base, which was deemed a threat by the colonial powers. Nkrumah was arrested forthwith together with other founding members of the UGCC. Tension began to build up as the founding members blamed Nkrumah's radicalism for their incarceration. Perhaps one could argue that Nkrumah agitated the way he did simply because he wanted the best for Ghana and for Africa by extension, and perhaps not. You see, this recalcitrant behavior of Nkrumah will be a sign that Nkrumah was not one to submit himself to constitutional authority. As things progressed and he became a leading figure in Ghanaian politics, Nkrumah would excuse his actions as the will of the people or as what needed to be done. Inevitably, the split happened between UGCC and Nkrumah. But keep in mind that while he was still a member of the UGCC, he floated organizations whose missions weren't in alignment with the UGCC. One of these was the Committee on Youth Organization, which was meant to be a youth arm of the UGCC. But the motto was self-government now, as opposed to the aim of UGCC to achieve self-governance in the shortest possible time. Nkrumah would launch his own party and name it the Convention People's Party. Soon after the launch of the CPP, the British convened a selected commission of middle-class Africans, including the founders of the UGCC, but Nkrumah wasn't invited. The goal of the commission was to draft a new constitution that would give Ghana self-government in the shortest possible time, but Nkrumah believed that the constitution was not good enough as it didn't give Ghana full dominion status. He organized again and riots broke out. Now, it's easy to say that what he did was the right thing because he was fighting for the freedom of his people, but we now see after 6 decades that self-government is more complicated than African freedom fighters envisioned. Moving on, in the ensuing crisis, services throughout the country were disrupted and Nkrumah was again arrested and sentenced to 1 year imprisonment. But the Gold Coast first general election saw Nkrumah elected to parliament. He was released from prison to become leader of government business and in 1952, Prime Minister of the Gold Coast. When the Gold Coast and the British Togoland Trust Territory became an independent state within the British Commonwealth as Ghana in March 1957, Nkrumah became the new nation's first prime minister. Ghana will be the first nation to achieve independence, putting Kwame Nkrumah in the spotlight. Kwame Nkrumah became the talk of the continent as many African nations became even more hopeful that they also could proceed to become independent as soon as possible. Nkrumah seized the moment to advance the message of Pan-Africanism, which was initially welcomed by all African leaders. Throughout Nkrumah's time as head of state, he will become a founding member of the Organization of African Unity and he will become a recipient of the Lenin Peace Prize from the Soviet Union. Nkrumah strongly believed that he was setting an example for all of Africa. He was hailed as a redeemer, Osagyefo. During his time as the head of state, Nkrumah will focus on 2 major issues amongst many others, one being an accelerated development plan for education, the other being a 7-year development plan for national reconstruction. These nationwide projects garnered applause not just in Ghana but in the international community, but all wasn't as it seemed. Not long after Ghana's independence, Nkrumah was already being accused of favoritism and preferential treatment in government promotions. This would lead to riots. Nkrumah would also seek to eliminate tribal powers as he believed they were undemocratic and complicit to British colonial powers. You will see the hypocrisy in this in a couple of moments. This point of tribal chiefs being complicit is historically accurate, not just in Ghana but in Nigeria and perhaps other European colonies in Africa. However, Nkrumah would proceed to make a strong point by passing an act in 1957 which banned regional and tribal-based political parties. Nkrumah would not stop there. He would move to remove local chiefs who did not show full loyalty to him and to his party. This might have gone unnoticed for most, but it would prove to be the beginning of the creation of a one-party Ghanaian communist state under the iron grip of Kwame Nkrumah. In my research, I came across a number of journals with numerous citations, and I will read out some excerpts that address the economy and the civil service during Nkrumah's administration. I'll put in the name of the article and the link in the description so you can continue to read on your own. On the economy, Nkrumah left Ghana with a serious balance of payments problem, beginning with a substantial foreign reserve fund of over $500 million at the time of independence. Ghana, by 1966, had a public external debt of over $800 million. This meant that there was no foreign exchange to buy the spare parts and raw materials required for the economy, while inflation was rampant, causing the price level to rise by 30% in 1964 to 1965. Unemployment was also serious. These needs and demand of the population under these circumstances simply could not be met. How much of Ghana's economic troubles can be attributed to corruption is difficult to determine. The decline in the world price of cocoa, from which 2/3 of Ghana's export earnings were derived, was certainly an important factor, but irresponsible external borrowing, amounting to almost $500 million between 1961 and 1966, together with the mismanagement of resources, must be considered equally responsible for what happened. On the civil service, in Ghana, the public sector spends a far larger proportion of the national income than is the case in Western countries. By the end of 1964, nearly 70% of Ghanaian wage earners were public employees who were then responsible for nearly all of the significant sectors of the economy and for 27% of manufacturing output. In the United States, on the other hand, most essential services, including electricity, communication, and transportation, are furnished by private firms. As bad as corruption may be in an American city, basic services, if profitable, continue to be performed. While profit-making incentives may induce corruption, they also facilitate the performance of work. Profit may be excessive, but there is at least a certain output. Internal corruption may be a problem, but it is seldom allowed to destroy the firm. Moreover, even the failure of a private firm is unlikely to have the same social impact as the failure of a public agency. Since so much depends on the public sector in Ghana, the consequences of political corruption combined with mismanagement are correspondingly great. In Accra, for example, this combination has had a devastating effect on municipal administration, resulting in the demise of the public transportation system. Prior to 1958, the Accra Tema City Council's omnibus service was reasonably satisfactory and profitable. Between 1958 and 1964, the bus service was taken over by the Municipal Transport Authority, but it ceased to be either profitable or efficient because of the shortage of spare parts, difficulties in obtaining import licenses, undue political influence, embezzlement and stealing, and employment of redundant staff. The City Council was allowed to resume operation of the bus service in 1965, but with only 28 functioning buses instead of the 123 that it had in 1958, and with only a small percentage of its former assets. In 1965, 120 American buses were imported, costing almost 50% more than the British buses which the city had been using. This purchase was initiated by the executive chairman and the town clerk, allegedly under pressure from Nkrumah, with the standard 10% kickback in mind, but without council approval and without independent technical or legal advice. These buses proved completely unsuitable for Ghanaian urban conditions. Only 8 of the first 50 were functioning less than 2 years after they were put into operation. The resulting lack of a municipal bus service makes late arrival at work in Accra understandable and excusable, but hardly conducive to national productivity. While Nkrumah remained scornful of the post-coup commission report, he admitted that his own efforts to reduce corruption were of limited success. My difficulty was to get the police to enforce the principles I laid down. Henry Breton asserts that Nkrumah was never serious about his periodic campaigns to reduce corruption. It was not a surprise to his commissioner of police when Nkrumah, upon being informed of spreading bribery and corruption in the highest government and party circles, time and again turned down requests for punitive corrective action. Nkrumah's anti-corruption campaigns, Omari suggests, were not so much to reduce corruption as to put fear in his underlings, thereby improving his own tactical position. Geoffrey Byng, the Englishman who served for many years as Nkrumah's Attorney General and Chief Advisor, acknowledges Nkrumah's failure to follow through in any meaningful way his denunciations of corruption, particularly his famous dawn broadcast of April 8, 1961. Byng, however, places the blame not on Nkrumah but on the civil service, which from the top post downwards were opposed to any showdown which might imperil the existing structure of power. It is safe to suggest that Ghana was imploding economically and socio-politically. But to top it all up, Nkrumah wasn't as concerned about Ghana, its economy, or the Ghanaian voters who brought him to power. All he cared for was his agenda of uniting Africa. It was a catastrophic case of misplaced priorities. Here are 3 major legislative moves that Kwame Nkrumah made that changed everything. After these moves, it was impossible to still see Nkrumah as a bastion of democracy. He had crossed a threshold and there was no going back. Here are the 3 legislative moves. Number 1, the Preventive Detention Act of 1958. This decree gave power to the Prime Minister to detain certain persons for up to 5 years without trial. Number 2, the precedence of double jeopardy of 1962. In 1962, Nkrumah violated the double jeopardy law and went ahead to charge a group of young members of the CPP after they had been acquitted. Shortly afterwards, Nkrumah made the CPP-dominated parliament amend the constitution to give the president the power to summarily remove judges at all levels, which essentially gave Nkrumah full control of Ghana's judicial arm. Number 3, the president for life in 1964. In 1964, the constitution was again amended to make the CPP the only legal party with Nkrumah as president for life. The law passed with 99% of the votes, making Nkrumah's presidency a de facto legal dictatorship. In simple terms, this meant that a man who was voted in could no longer be voted out. Let that sink in for a minute. After these laws, Nkrumah had moved from the democratic leader who was celebrated to the dictator who was feared. This was a full betrayal of Ghana's democracy. It would have been understandable if Nkrumah came into power through a coup. Since he was first elected as leader of government business in 1951, the people believed that they had the power to vote in and to vote out. They voted again after the constitutional reforms in 1954 and again in 1956 before the independence was announced. The Ghanaians believed that their nation was a true democracy. 7 years into Nkrumah's regime, they would realize that Ghana was not really a democracy. It was a socialist nation run by a communist dictator. This was a breach of trust on Nkrumah's part. Looking at Nkrumah's actions, it is clear that he believed that any African leader who didn't share the same vision as he about the destiny of Africa was not genuine and didn't deserve the leadership. This bordered on narcissism and megalomania, and all it could produce was the same oppression that he swore to fight against. To Nkrumah, it was my way or the highway. Many Africans are either naively ignorant or simply choose to deny what I'm about to say, but the fact is Nkrumah's playbook was similar to the playbook used by Mao Zedong of China. It was the typical communist template that many communist leaders adopted in the 20th century in order to arrive at their so-called socialist ideals. Here are some parallels Nkrumah's Ghana had with Mao's China. Nkrumah considered education as religion, which made education a means of indoctrination rather than enlightenment. Nkrumah consolidated state control over the media. Nkrumah made himself president for life. Nkrumah taught the concept of Nkrumahism to school-age children in the same manner that Maoism was taught to Chinese children through the Red Book. Don't be deceived. This wasn't a coincidence. Some even speculate that when Nkrumah toured Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, and the People's Republic of China, he adopted the attire known as the Mao suit. The attire was named as such because of the fondness that Mao Zedong had for it. Finally, some of you watching might not know these things I have discussed because most people casually ascribe the downfall of Kwame Nkrumah to the machinations of the CIA. This doesn't mean I am absolving the CIA of all its wiretapping and its attempt to influence the Ghanaian government. The CIA, no doubt, are opportunists and instigators of chaos, and that's no news. But I do not believe that there was enough reason for Nkrumah's paranoia and consolidation of powers to the level to which he did it. Besides, CIA or no CIA, he did what he did because that was the path he believed Ghana should have been on. He didn't bother seeking counter-argument or opposing viewpoints, which was the democratic way. Rather, he silenced all opposition. As far as Nkrumah was concerned, what he was doing was the anti-West, anti-European, anti-capitalist, pro-African way to go, and no one dared to disagree. With all this said, Nkrumah is still seen as an African legend. He still has his loyalists. He never really took accountability for his actions, which is typical of Nkrumah considering his antecedents. But it is imperative that we know what he did and that we make our own conclusions about Osagyefo the Redeemer, and whether following in his footsteps is the right way to go. Thank you for listening. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It helps with the algorithm. On this channel, I focus on African thought leadership on 3 fronts: religion, economy, and politics. So if you want to see more content on that, you can subscribe. Thank you and see you in the next video.